Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Melissa Brown, Director of Alumni Relations, and I am happy for you all to be joining us for our third virtual event this week. And tonight, I'm delighted that we will be having our book conversation about the lore of the Wissahickon. Clark Groom, class of 1960, will be moderating, and um, I will ask that if there are any questions, and Clark will mention this as he goes along, if there are any questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and Clark will monitor those. And then also I will put a link in the chat for you all to purchase the book if you would like. So Clark, thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. It's a great honor to be here. We're going to have a wonderful conversation, I'm sure, with the author, Paul Hines, who, along with Eamon Javers, who was going to be interviewing him, both entered what was then CHA, Chestnut Hill Academy, in 1981. Paul is a teacher. Eamon is a member of Bob Hayden's fourth grade class. See, I looked it up. I told you I was going to. Paul also taught Eamon in seventh grade or fifth grade, and then eventually moved into seventh grade and middle school, and coached Eamon as a hurdler. You were a hurdler. So these guys have known each other for 40 years. We're also going to be joined by lifer Andy Much from the class of 2015, who's the son of Linda Dudley Much, class of 1978, and an old friend. As a fellow dark blue, the other two are light blues, for those of you who care. Andy took advantage of all the CHA had to offer, from players to varsity golf. He also was taught by Paul Hines and was a 2-miler on the track team, and he's an alumnus of Gettysburg. So he would be celebrating a year late his 5th reunion, and Eamon is celebrating a year late his 30th reunion, and I'm celebrating a year late my 60th. So a lot of reunion going on, enough chatter from me. I'm going to turn it over to Eamon, who can carry on a little bit of a chat with Paul about the book. Eamon, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Clark. I can't believe you did your research like that. That was a trip down memory lane. I am just thrilled to be here. And I have to confess, I did go for a run just before this because I thought that Coach Hines would be disappointed in me if I did not. So I'm not going to reveal my times or my distances, but I did put in the work, Coach. Look, this is a fabulous book. It's called The Lore of the Wissahickon. Coach Hines and I have been talking about his work on it over the years. And I think we should just start, Mr. Hines, with the history of this history, which is, how did you get into the idea of doing the research on Chestnut Hill Academy, the Wissahickon Inn, and then turning that research into a book? I mean, this was a decades-long process, right?
That is correct. Before I get into answering your question, I want to throw something out to the audience, a little trivia question that they can mull over throughout our program, and I will reveal the answer at the end of the program. Don't need to enter it in chat or Q&A. And that is, what were the original school colors of Chestnut Hill Academy?
Oh, that's great.
So keep that in mind as we go through this. But as Clark said, and also I can take the blame if anything went wrong with Eamon's education or Andy's education. Well, I don't claim anything for Clark.
Fair enough.
But what happened was, when I first got here to Chestnut Hill Academy in 1981, I did some local history work with my classrooms, and we did research in the Wissahickon Inn and the buildings, and also the Forbidden Drive down in the valley, and also on Chestnut Hill itself. And about 1986, anonymous alum came forward to Stan Parker, head of the history department, and said, that Charlie Landreth, who was a 1929 grad and headed Alumni and back as business manager throughout the years, had all these stories in his head, and he's up in his 80s, and it'd be a shame if all those stories went to waste and were forgotten. So they came to me and asked me to come up with a project. And my idea was to do an oral history with Charlie. So I did the research through all the yearbooks and Wissahickons and the Campus Lantern, and came up with a list of questions on the decades from the 1920s to the 1980s. I interviewed Charlie on each of the decades. I would give him all the questions on that decade, and he would answer ones that he was comfortable answering and tell me stories about it. Then I would back each decade up with somebody else, like in 1920s and 1930s was Monty Haynes, who was 1931 grad. I went all the way up to Barnaby Roberts and Owen Boyer in the 1980s. And I stopped there because that's where Charlie was at that particular time. But I always had ambitions of getting back to the project. But raising two kids and coaching and teaching kind of curtailed that until a couple of years ago when I went to Steve Drugan and said, I'd like to start to cut back in the classroom. So he came up with an idea about working in the development office and also continue to coach. And also going back, besides those 22 hours of tapes with Charlie and the other people in 1920, 1980, Charlie had me write the boarders that were still alive from the 1920s and 1930s. There was a fair amount that were still alive in 1986, and he wrote me back stories. This is before days of computers and laptops and things like that. And he hand-wrote letters back to me, telling me about stories of life in the upper third floor of the building. So that was the base of my information I used for the book. So when Steve asked me to write the history of the inn, not the history of the school, Clark's done a great job of writing the history of the school up to 2011 for 150th anniversary of the school. So I said I would write the history of the inn itself. So what I did was I did more research about the building and the rooms and so forth. So I would take you inside the exchange and tell you what the exchange was used for back in the day when it was a hotel, and then what it was used for when it became an inn, and then the school moved in. And then I would interview people like Clark and ask him what rooms or spaces were his favorite spaces and tell me stories about why they were his favorite spaces. So I did a lot of interviews over the last year and a half to get more information. And so it turned out to be a fun project to do.
Well, I'm so glad that you did it, because the history of that building, you know, for those of us who went to the school and love the school, it's a part of our lives. And you read through the book, and I just got such a thrill from seeing all the pictures of my contemporaries and sort of the window of time when I was there. And I'm sure everybody will have a similar experience going back and looking for the familiar faces. I recognize so many people there. And I just want to take a moment before we dive too deep into the book, just to say to Coach Hines what an important figure he was for me in my life and my education on that track team. You know, there's a lot of mentoring that goes on and a lot of learning that goes on. And I got the chance to captain one of Coach Hines' teams in 1990 and learned a lot about leadership there, learned a lot about myself. You learn a lot about yourself on the third turn of a quarter mile, including what you did in terms of preparation and what you have in terms of heart. And, you know, among the lessons that I learned is it doesn't matter how far you go until you're exhausted, particularly in track. It matters how far you can go after you're exhausted. And those things, you know, stick with you for a lifetime. And they have stuck with me for a lifetime. And, you know, I'm pushing 50 now, and I still remember all those moments. Just important leadership. And Coach Hines was just tough, but fair. And I think for all of us who went through his track teams over the years, we really appreciate that and what that brought to our lives. And I know you're still at it and you're still running. And I was glad to see that this past week. Some of my classmates sent around some of the pictures of the run you did just this week. So I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to be part of this conversation with you, Coach.
I could use you on the track team.
Yeah.
I need a hurdler.
Yeah, every now and then you're going to get a good hurdler. You didn't my year, but I'm confident you might have one coming up.
I think we do have some coming up.
It's
So,
been a tough couple of years with COVID, but I'm sure the program will get back together. And let's dive back into the book for a second. Now that I've taken my point of personal privilege, because the earliest history of the inn is interesting. Because for what has become a school and a place of education, I mean, this was a business opportunity for somebody to build this inn, and this was somebody who was thinking about making some money. And it seems, my read of it is, it seems like that didn't really work, right? I mean, the business was not a long-term success anyway, and they needed to find another use for the building. What were the oldest documents that you found, the oldest evidence of the planning for the inn and how it came about?
the current inn was the site of a previous hotel called the Park Hotel that burnt down in, I think, 1877. I think it was built in 1867. So that's the first evidence of some structure on this property. And Henry Houston purchased about 3,000 acres up from Germantown through this area up into Roxborough. And oddly enough, he put the railroad through to Chestnut Hill on the west side. And the railroad kind of did him in, the occupancy of the inn. The reason I say that because for about 10 years from 1884, when Wissahickon Inn was completed, it was pretty well filled up because people would take the railroad out here, and the Chestnut Hill area was cooler, and it got away from the smoke and the dust and noise of the industrial Philadelphia. So a lot of the lawyers or bankers would come out here for a vacation for the weekend to get to the cool weather or stay a week during the summer months. And what did that clientele do when railroads were put through to other spaces like Cape May in the 1890s? They began to take customers away from Wissahickon Inn to those other locales for vacations. And that's when they began to look for other revenues. And one area of revenue that they began to use was Henry Houston came up with the idea of a horse show. At one time, they had 10,000 people on the grounds here for the horse show. But that lasted for a while, but the inn continued to lose money because it was 250 room building, and they couldn't fill it. And they began to look for ways to make money during the winter, because obviously people didn't want to venture out to the cold Chestnut Hill during the winter. So that's when they approached the school, Chestnut Hill Academy. At that time, it was located down on Germantown Avenue and was beginning to grow. And they made a deal with the Houstons to occupy the building during the winter months.
What do you know about the amenities that were offered early on? I mean, was this a recreational crowd that was coming out to enjoy the cool air, or was this a luxury resort? How would you describe the kind of clientele and the activities that they were doing when they were out there?
Well, from my readings and research, it was mostly middle class to upper class clientele that came out, and for various reasons. As I said before, one was to escape Philadelphia during the summer months as a vacation spot. And Henry Houston also built a cricket club, okay, for recreation. Cricket was a big sport. And also what affected the inn itself too was because as the 1890s grew along, people began to turn to tennis as opposed to cricket. But cricket was a big sport they played here. But they would go for walks down in Valley Green in the coolness of the woods. They would jump in Surprise Lake that was nearby that came after a storm down by Buttercup Cottage. They would also go horseback riding, carriage riding. They didn't supply carriages that you could go down to Valley Green and go along the Forbidden Drive area as well.
Was the cricket club open simultaneously to the inn serving as an inn, and were the resident or the guests at the inn able to use all the amenities at the club, or was it already done being an inn by the time they developed the club?
I think I don't know the sequence on that, but yeah. the cricket clubs competed around the same time.
Yeah.
So I assume that the residents, I didn't come across any specific information that the residents of the inn walked across the street to play cricket, but
right.
Sure they played it or watched it or whatever.
It's right in the backyard, so to speak.
Right.
What do you know about what it took to convert this business? Well, before we talked about converting to a school, how about the end of the Inn years? Once the railroad sort of did them in economically, how long did they sort of struggle to keep that business operating? And was the building sort of defunct and empty at any point, or were they able to transition pretty quickly to a school use?
I think also what affected it was Henry Houston died, I believe, in 1895.
Okay.
I'm sure that had an effect upon the future of the inn itself, but I think it was a gradual realization that it was not going to be as profitable as they thought it was. And as time went on, they would begin to lose money. So they began to look for other ways to generate income. And the inn itself began to lose occupancy, I guess, from September to almost May or June. So they probably had about 2 months of clientele that was coming into the inn itself.
And so was there an overlap period where they were operating both an inn and using rooms for a school?
Yes, there was at one time, because for a few years with the horse show here, the residents of the horse show would be allowed to occupy some of the rooms that were available still.
Yeah. I've seen pictures of the early Chestnut Hill Academy building, which is, I think, on Germantown Avenue. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, the original building was up on Rex and Germantown Avenue, in a small building that actually had no water supply. They had to run a hose up from a neighbor building to have water in the building itself.
Yeah.
And then in 1895, the Chestnut Hill, I guess they had a new board, and one was Henry, a man by the name of Henry Wolcott, who reorganized the school and moved it down to Germantown Avenue, basically where the Venetian Club is right now. And that began to expand. And one reason they were looking for a bigger location was they didn't have a gym. So they felt that, particularly with boys, they needed a gym. So
But it was a tiny school, though, right? At that time. I mean, I've seen the pictures. The building is small. I think there's one picture that I remember from when I was a kid where they had the entire student body in the picture, and it's like 30 people. I mean,
it's about 30, 35 people.
And they move into this enormous inn. I can't imagine what that transition was like, people echoing around the empty hallways, but they didn't have nearly enough students to fill that building when they started, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's when they got the idea of opening up to borders, going to foreign countries. I mean, we've had the Prince of Siam here and people from Honduras and South American countries. And that started with, I think in 1898, the headmaster at that time lived off campus, and he actually had the two boarders living with him at that point in time. That was the beginning of the boarding school. So they relied upon that. I think they eventually got up to about 90 to 100 boarders by the 1920s. They began to advertise also to try to get local clientele to come to the school.
And you mentioned that you talked to a number of those boarders back in the 1980s. Who was the oldest student, or the student with the memories dating the farthest back that you spoke to? And what did they tell you about the sort of the earliest memories of a CHA alum who you overlapped with?
Let's see if I understand that question correctly. Charlie Landreth was probably the oldest one I interviewed that went back to 1916 when he was in first grade.
Yeah, wow.
He was a graduate of 29. So he had a lot of stories about faculty and some of the dining room and areas like that.
There's a great question in the comments here, which is, are there any remnants of the original CHA building on Rex Avenue and Germantown? I don't know that intersection off the top of my head. Is the original building still there, or was it demolished?
There's a church there now on Rex Avenue.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of the Venetian Club is part of that building when it moved down there in 1895.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I interrupted your story about the oldest memories that you were able to capture from a real life witness. What did he tell you about what the building was like in those years?
He talked about some winters that were very cold, and also about roller skating around on the porches that were, because as you know, one time the porches wrapped around the entire school. So he talked about stories like that. He also talked about sledding down the hill here where the Jordan building is, down into the valley, to Valley Green Inn. That's roughly about almost 0.8 of a mile to that point. So they would get a few runs in, but not too many. It was tough coming back up the hill.
I can't even imagine the maintenance of painting all those floorboards for the porches going all the way around that building. It's an enormous, it's acres of porch
Right.
to extend all the way around the building.
Two reasons why they tore down the porches was because they realized with the porches out there, light going into the first floor rooms was not that good. So they opened up because of that. We're right now in the Henry Library, and that's why the porches were taken off for the library to open it up to get light in here. Also, some of the porches needed repair, and I think as they got into the 1920s, they began to fall short on money. And so they, instead of repairing them, they tore them down. Also, one thing I learned about the building itself is that right now there is one turret in the middle of the building over the main entrance to the school. Once upon a time, going back at least to 1900, 1910 maybe, is that there's a turret on either corner. And that's
You know what happened to the other one?
the other two, I heard they were torn down because of maintenance issues,
Yeah.
again, for cost of things.
Well, Adam Holland, my classmate who's in the chat here, wants me to mention the windows, speaking of maintenance issues, because he and I, in the early 1990s, had a summer job one summer of cleaning every window in that building.
Oh,
And it took us weeks. We brought in a number of other CHA kids, and we bit off more than we can chew with that project. I mean, the building is enormous. It just goes and goes and goes. And when you think you have the windows clean, you turn the corner and there's an entire other wing that you missed. That project took us forever. And I can't imagine how much money and time and effort has gone in over a century plus of maintaining it. I mean, I did my 2 weeks duty on it, but that must be just an enormous cost of operating the inn at first and then the school now.
right. And one time they realized they didn't have a sprinkler system up on the third floor.
Yeah,
Back in 1980s when they redid the red roof. They also,
I remember that. I was there then.
right. They realized if we get a fire up here, we're done.
Yeah.
So they quickly had a fundraiser and raised money for a sprinkler system and up there to protect it. But yeah, the maintenance costs of this building, all the painting and the roofing and the pipes inside and the heating and the air conditioning, it's tremendous.
When I was a kid, we used to sneak up into the third floor, which was derelict at that time. Just like, I mean, it was like a haunted house up there. And we would sneak up. There were a couple of doors where we knew that you could jimmy the lock and get in there. And the rooms for the boarders were almost pristine. I mean, you felt like you walked into 1921 with a coat of dust on it. I mean, it was shocking how much had been preserved up there intact. How did that boarding program work? I mean, was it a success financially, or did they finally figure that they needed to pivot to the day students and they needed that space? Ultimately, well after I was gone, they needed that space for the day students.
The boarding school was very prosperous in the early 1920s. They hired a headmaster that had boarding school experience. I think his name was Hyde. And it was great throughout the 20s. As you got to the end of the 1920s with the foreshadowing of the Great Depression, boarders began to abandon SCH Academy as boarders. And it got to the point where by 1934, I think they might have been down to about 20 some boarders. And that's when they had a study, I think his name was Griswold from the University of Pennsylvania, came out and did a year-long study about the profitability of the boarding department. And they concluded that the spring of 1934 was going to be the last of the boarders at the school itself, that they had to close it because of the Great Depression, because they were losing particularly the foreign students, and American students couldn't afford to come here anymore. So they greatly dropped in enrollment.
How did they survive that? I mean, that seems like, with the maintenance costs we're talking about, just the operations, the salaries of the staff, just an enormous challenge. And then you lose that revenue from, the Prince of Siam and all the rich guys who are coming in from overseas with paying full freight. You're running into operational difficulty, right?
And that's where the Woodwards and the Houstons come in.
Right. Saving the day.
The two families supported the school financially. So when they went into the red, the two families would step up and put some funds into the building itself. So that greatly helped. And obviously, if you have less students here, you're going to cut down on staff and cut down on payroll.
Yeah, I mean, just a real challenging between the Depression and the war, just a real challenging number of years. And without that, they would have had to shutter the building.
Right. Going back to the third floor again, you mentioned about haunted house. I'm not sure it was done when you were here, but the seniors would put on a haunted house up on the third floor.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. We didn't do it as seniors, but I went through it as a kid a couple of times. It was terrifying.
It was scary. Even for teachers, it was scary.
So in doing your research, all of this is so fascinating to me because I spent so much time in that building. But what stuck out to you? What was your favorite discovery in this process?
Some things I didn't know about. One was the bridal suite.
Yeah.
And after I came across it, I said,
there was no bridal suite. There's no bridal suite when I was there.
Logically, they should have a bridal suite.
Yeah.
What was odd about it was that it had a sitting room, which is not odd. It had a bathroom, and then 2 bedrooms.
Why do you need 2 bedrooms in a bridal suite? This is like the opening of a joke.
I don't know unless the mother-in-law came along.
That's okay. That's a fun image. Where was the bridal suite? Do you know? In the building physically?
You remember Ted Barber's history room?
Sure, I had history there.
In the corner?
Yeah.
By the library, above the library. That's where
Right.
the bridal suite was.
Wow. And do you have a favorite place in the building after all these years and after all this research?
Yeah, I think I do. I think it's the chapel
Yeah. Why?
because so many good things happen there.
Yeah.
The assemblies, speeches, celebrating birthdays or teachers leaving or new teachers, seeing the lower school boys in their jerseys, seeing productions by little kids and middle school kids. For 3 years in a row, we had a medieval festival for 7th grade. We put on plays dealing with the Middle Ages, and we had the plague come to the school and detection of crime and trials by a jury and so forth. And just so many things in my lifetime here have happened in the chapel.
But that space wasn't always a chapel, right?
It was a ballroom.
Yeah, which is a totally different way of using that room.
Right. It was a ballroom for the inn. Obviously, they had dances here and things like that going on, and I'm sure they use it for other things. And then the school used it briefly as a gym.
Yeah.
And then the Woodwards came forward about 1904 to 1905, and they wanted a chapel. The school had a loose affiliation with the Episcopal Church. In fact, I talked to some people that were students here in the 1960s. They still started each morning in chapel with a little religious service.
Mm-hmm.
And the Woodwards wanted stained glass windows put into and a chapel built. And that's what was converted from a gym ballroom to a chapel. And the 3 stained glass windows in the front wall deal with the Epiphany, the birth of Christ and the Magi and the shepherds. And then classes have donated the other windows that deals with understanding of humanity, about the arts and science and things like that, dealing with education.
Wasn't there a story at one point about one of the earliest Oldsmobiles being parked in there?
Yes, Dr. Patterson supposedly parked. As we did the research, Clark looked into it. I'm sorry, Deirdre Lingard looked into it too because she was fascinated by it. And we're not quite sure it was an Oldsmobile, but it was some car that he had. It was a convertible.
Apparently it was an Oldsmobile, and I'm going to interrupt this for a minute because we're halfway through our hour, and I want to turn the focus from Paul for a minute to Eamon and Andy, and first ask Eamon, what are your fondest memories of the building, and what are some of the things that you were involved with as a student here?
Well, look, I mean, I have a lot of fond memories. Obviously, being on Coach Hines' track team, the track is one of my fondest memories. The place there, a lot of pain and suffering, but also a lot of joy out there. And I'm thrilled that if you buy the book, which I recommend you do, this is the plug, right? Buy the book, and if you go to the last page, there is a fabulous 2-page spread of the track and the campus. And
Hines track.
yes, and the place where I learned the most about myself was right here on this back straight, coming around the end of the third turn. That's where you learn whether you want it or not. And I put in a lot of hard hours there. So that place for me is just an amazing memory. And then I have a great memory of the upper school hallway my senior year. So that was 1990. Our senior class prank was breaking into the head of the upper school's room. And one of the students, who I will not name, had obtained keys to the school. So we broke in overnight and got into Owen Boyer's office. He was the head of the upper school then. And somebody in our class, I forget who, and some of my classmates are on the chat, might actually remember all these details, but somebody rented a helium tank, and we bought about 5,000 balloons. And we got in there about midnight and started filling up balloons. And we filled Owen Boyer's office floor to ceiling, wall to wall with balloons. And it took hours, and we were convinced we were going to get caught. Certainly there's security coming, the police are going to arrest us, we're all going to jail. But it was a lot of fun, and it was a great class bonding thing. It was a great prank, and mostly harmless. And when Boyer came in the morning, he opened the door, and the place was filled with balloons. You couldn't see any of the furniture, anything. And his response to it was great, I thought. He actually called up the lower school boys and had them all march up in a line. And he stood there out front of his office, and he handed each one of them a balloon until that office was empty, which I think took 3 hours or something like that. I mean, it was kind of crazy, but it was fun. And just a really good memory and really good class bonding for us. And we were able to do the senior prank, but not actually hurt anybody or anything or do any lasting damage.
Andy, what about your memories of the building?
Oh man, so
You're
many.
a lifer, right?
Yes, sir. Yep. I think walking up the steps of the inn and shaking Mr. Steele's hand or Dr. Parker's hand, or the middle school head or the lower school head, and then coming into the exchange, especially in the wintertime with the fire roaring, seeing Miss Cruz there. And I always loved that whole strip there from the library to the chapel, just because, you left home, but then you came back home in a way, because you were surrounded by all your friends and teachers that really cared for you, and especially Mr. Hines, who definitely was a big mentor in my life and still is. And he helped me realize that I love history. He lit that spark, and that's why another reason why I went to Gettysburg was because of the trip that we took there as a class in 7th grade. And then there are just the countless memories of Mr. Hines and I running down the halls and tackling each other, or he's trying to grab my shoulder. I'm sneaking up behind him, trying to grab his shoulder. And, I could go on for hours, but I'll save everyone's ears, all the different memories I have. But I think the whole building was this wonderful family, and it was a playground of sorts, just creating memories. And that's why when I finished reading this book that everyone should buy, I immediately thought of it was like the Masters or the Super Bowl. You watch it, and the next day you want to go out and play that one sport. For me, it was I finished this book, and I immediately wanted to call all my friends, my whole grade, get them together and just walk and remember the memories and all the fun pranks and jokes and talks we had.
I have a question, Andy. Did you spend enough time in D13 for that to become a prominent memory for you? I spent a lot of time.
I was afraid to get in trouble. I remember I had one detention my whole time there, but I was the head of focus. So I at one point, so we had pizza and Bible study in there, but I definitely had some pranks going on in there. D13 is a notorious room in the what's it?
Was that a detention room when you guys were there? Because it was back in the 50s when I was there.
It was detention for us, and only detention. I think detention and SATs. SAT prep was the only thing you could do in there. I spent so much time. I don't know if this was true when you were there, Andy, but they had all the class awards hanging over the front door to D13, actually all around the room. And so you had all the awards for different things for over the years, each year listed, each kid's name. And I spent so much time with that. I had almost all those kids' names memorized because it was like people going back to the 1950s, you know, who set school records and this or that. It was all up there, and that's all you had to look at for an hour. So
Let me ask Melissa, since we've had a couple of commercials here, can you put the way to get the book, way to buy the book back on the bottom of the chat, because there's been a lot of other stuff between the original entry, and certainly hope that everybody will buy it. It's a terrific book, and Paul has done a marvelous job of capturing the book, not just, but the feel of the place.
do they still use D13 for detentions? What's the current status there?
I missed the question, Eamon.
I was just going to say, bring us up to the present day on D13 at least. Is that still the place of doom?
No, it's not. What happened was one theme of the book is that the building has always adapted to the needs of the school. If the school needed to do something, the inn adapted to it, and it adapted to COVID because we needed extra space for classrooms, because we split some classes in two to have the right number in the right space. So what they did at D13 was they put a wall down the middle of it, and they turned it into two classrooms. Now I understand that it's going back to the way it looked this summer. The maintenance crew is going in there. I believe they're going to take the wall down and put it back to what looked like D13, but it's used for Red Cross, have blood drives. It's used for fairs and assemblies sometimes. So it's used for various activities.
So nobody got a detention during all of COVID, huh?
Not that I know of.
This must be the most well-behaved students in the history of the school.
I think.
Oh, they were all at home.
I think kids got lectured about when they show up for school virtually, they need to be out of their pajamas at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right. That's important.
And
So
I'd just like to add about the book. It reads so well, and it's so fun, especially to, picture yourself in the different chapters about the different areas of the inn. And there were some parts like the exchange, one of my favorite places, as I mentioned. I was like, why has it always been called that? I like the name, and then boom, the answer's there. So this book really helps fill in a lot of those questions that you ask yourself when you're there, or you're visiting your family member or your son or daughter now. And so I really appreciated all the hard work and research that really went into this book.
I'm not doing it justice here with the lighting, but the photography is just gorgeous, right? I mean, the images are just great, and you can really see some of the details of the history. I want to use this opportunity to ask a question I've wanted to know the answer to since I was a kid, which was, when I was there was this story about the library, that the artwork, the paintings on the wall, which are here on page 49 of the book, and also page 51, there was a hole in the toe of one of those paintings. And I don't know if you know this story, Mr. Hines, but the legend that I heard was that a student at some point was disgruntled about something and took a bow and arrow and stood at the fireplace and shot an arrow the entire length of the library and hit that painting in the toe. And that's why there was a hole in the toe. I don't know if that's apocryphal or real, or what if you can shed some light on that for me. I've been wondering that for about 45 years.
I haven't heard all the details of that. I did hear that a student put the hole in the toe, but I've not heard about the bow and arrow.
Yeah.
And then I'd heard the same story, but there's no evidence because nobody was going to admit to it, I guess. And the arrow is long since gone. Right.
Well, we'll just call that one, in journalism, they call that a story that's too good to check, right?
Yep,
So we'll
absolutely.
we'll just
Just
assume
let
it's
it
true.
go.
Yeah. How about the future of the building, Mr. Hines? You know, just since I was there, there've been so many changes, additions, new outbuildings, and now this entire new middle school and the new campus on what was the Springside campus when I was there, which looks fabulous. I had a chance to walk through there a few months ago. The school building has always adapted to the needs of the school, but I wonder what you think about where it is now with the new additions and where it's going in the years to come.
Good question. I think we've worked on the building because the hallway outside here, outside library was renovated, the exchange was renovated, the library was renovated. I think the next area within the school itself to be looked at for possible expansion is the third floor wing that has not been renovated. And one thing I would like to have done with that is you mentioned about the boarders' rooms, about they look pristine from the time that the students left their rooms, is to restore one of those rooms. And there's a couple up there that can be somewhat restored and have that as almost like a museum about what it looked like when it was a boarding school. And I think our student population is beginning to grow. So I think we're at an all-time high number of students. We're right now the largest private school in Philadelphia. Some of that is due to the strength of our early ed center that we opened up just about a year and a half ago over in the Jordan building. I think they have 60 students, and if they feed into our kindergarten and first grades in the future, then you can see the lower school getting more numbers of people. They've worked on the fields over in their master plan. They've redone the cafeteria. They fixed that up a little bit. They're going to redo the Woodward gym for more of a athletic facility, fitness center in that building. So that's on the horizon a few years down the line. And also the rec will be renovated in the next couple of years. So it'll be interesting where we are 20 years from now, or as you say, you've been out, 25, 30 years?
Yeah.
Where we're going to be in 30 years from now. I think pretty much the same look that we have, because I think it's a good look. But in a lot of ways, if you came to visit tomorrow here, it would be almost like home, as Andy says. You'd be home again.
Yeah.
Recognize everything, but little tweaks here and there as needed.
I think the rec does definitely need to be tweaked a little bit. And the rec was actually the first piece of investigative journalism that I was ever associated with in my career, was as the editor of the newspaper. Chris Terman, one of my classmates, came up with a story, and it was about a dispute between the hockey rink and the school over sewage that was pumping out of the back of the hockey rink and going right into the rec.
Right.
And so we did the headline. The headline, I think Steve Skillman, who was a year ahead of me, came up with the headline. It was "Rank Rink Ruining Rec." And we blew the lid off that story, and we exposed the fact that the rink was dumping its sewage in the rec. And we prompted all these fixes and everything that happened as a result of that story. But it was, and the administration at that time encouraged us not to print that story, and we did it anyway. So it was an early blow for journalistic freedom.
All right. Also, I'm not sure if you know about the rec, that one thing I found out in my recent research for the book is that it was double its size back up until 1953.
But it was originally a barn, or what was it originally?
Well, it was a stable for
Stable.
The horses connect with the carriages and the sleighs at the inn itself. And but there's a back part to it that the groomsmen and the people who worked there lived there. They had living quarters. And it was almost like what the picture looked like a T, where if this is the rec, on the back side of it was another building, and it also had turrets on it in the style of Wissahickon Inn itself. And what did it in was at 1953, the one wall collapsed because there's an underground stream that was there, and so they demolished that part and they kept what is currently the rec.
I would love to get some questions from the people who are watching. Gotten some comments, one from Meg Rhoda, whose father I knew as a teacher and whose mother I knew as a colleague when I worked there, and she was a receptionist and sat in the exchange. Her brother was a member of the class of '74. She loved the building and is really enjoying the talk. Do any of you who are watching have questions for any one of the three main panelists? We'd like to keep this going. I think that covers a lot.
I love this question, this comment here in the chat about damage done to the fireplace in the library.
Yeah.
And then a perpetrator came through years later and paid for the repairs. So guilty conscience will last a long time, I think.
Yeah, we
You
could
could probably
just
write a whole
with the
chapter.
arrow.
Right. You could probably write a whole chapter just on damage to the building done by students over the years.
Well, of course, when they renovated the third floor in 2002 to turn it into the middle school, I really wish they'd taken pictures of all of the writings and stuff that were up there. Some of them X-rated, I know, but it would have been fun to keep them somewhere in the archives. Tell us about Paul, tell us about the cover on the book.
I believe it's from a '77 grad of Springside, Judy Jarvis, that painted it. Steve asked her he commissioned her to paint the inn itself, and this is what she produced, and we said it would be a great cover for this book. And it's here behind me as well.
I need one of them.
It's going to be hung up in the hallway outside Steve's office, I believe, on the opposite wall. I think that he's going to try to commission some other paintings of other scenes around the campus.
Adam Holland has a good question here about the arcade. That those of us from the '70s and '80s might remember the arcade, which was a modernist expression of architecture that was built between the music wing and the cafeteria, and it was sort of this diagonal sloping thing that the people today might not remember. But why was that built, and who made the brilliant decision to tear it down?
Well, I can tell you why it was built. It was built because they were renovating the building, and somebody thought that it would be a good idea to have a way to get from the inn to the cafeteria, which was over the swimming pool, the old part of the old gym. So they built the arcade, which everybody hated.
Yeah.
And then they tore it down. I'm not quite sure when it was. It was around 1990. Was there when you were there, right?
It was there. Yeah, it was there when we graduated.
So it was maybe even 2000. They
Yeah.
tore it down, and there were a whole lot of people who were really, really, really sorry to see it go, even though everybody had hated it when it was first put up.
Well,
So
as Adam points out in the comments, my era, we had an entire game that was built around that
Roof
arcade
ball.
called Roof Ball. It involved a tennis ball and jumping up in the air and severe punishment for the losers. And it was a lot of fun.
that goes
And how
back
we're
a
doing it.
ways.
Does it?
Yeah, there were people used the roof of the arcade for games even back in the '70s and '80s, '70s.
Brian
Yeah.
Derby,
Before
who
your
came here-
time.
Brian Derby, who came here in fourth grade, was a '99 grad. And he said when he got here, he didn't know anybody. And what helped him acclimate to the school and to his classmates was playing roof ball.
Yep.
And
That's just
stuck with
those
him.
hangout hours that you had before school or after school and during free periods. We spent hours doing that.
Paul, you can probably answer this better than anybody. And this isn't a question on the chat, but it's one that I've had, because when I go over there these days, the building feels differently because it's just the upper school kids, 9 through 12, rather than having the various ages. How has that changed the way the building is used and how it feels to the people working in it?
Well, I know it feels strange around dismissal time because a lot of times I'd be walking from my classroom out the middle school entrance and round by Jordan Building, and be just loaded with kids waiting for their parents to pick them up. So I kind of miss that. That seems to be very different. And also hearing little kids running down the hallway, running up the steps and running to get to the cafeteria for lunch. It just has a different feel to it. So it's more quiet than it was before. So in some ways, I miss the little guys.
Do the kids leave their backpacks all up and down the hallways like we always did?
Oh yeah,
It was full of backpacks. Yeah, it was like a landmine.
it's worse now than before because some of those backpacks used to be down on the other campus, the Cherokee campus. So we got more backpacks, and that's going to affect the remodeling of the Woodward Gym because they're going to bump it out from the trophy cases a little bit more for more seating to adjust to the number of kids in the upper school. And so backpacks are going to get some more room to multiply again.
How
And
big
you got
is
to
the
put
school?
that indoor track in there too, right?
Yes, right.
I don't think so.
I mean, I didn't mind running down throughout the whole school, the third floor, down to the second, the first, and all the way back up. But I missed the indoor track. I remember running on that.
Yeah, Eamon, you ran on that track. What
Not everybody does miss.
Up on the third floor.
I loved that indoor track. It felt like you were in Chariots of Fire or something running on that track, because it was banked and they had like a little sawdust bag or something that was the flooring material of it.
Right.
And it was banked at such an angle that the tall guys, I didn't have this problem because I wasn't that tall, but there were iron struts that held it up. And the tall guys were running around the bank and your head would go like an inch from those iron struts as you were running along. You took your life in your hands up there.
Yeah, it could be dangerous, especially if you didn't know guys were running up there and you walked out of the stairwell and walked on the track, you'd be smacked right in your back.
Yeah, it was great. I loved it.
Built character.
Right, exactly.
But going back to some other spaces in the inn that I came upon that I didn't know before, and it's obvious besides the bridal suite, is a blacksmith shop,
Huh.
which is down where maintenance is located and the heating system and things like that was located in that area as well. But some of the stories were great. I thought I might read one of the raccoon stories because I got 3 raccoon stories in there.
Sure.
And this is one I was involved in, so it's probably one of my favorite stories. 64. Back in the 1990s, the middle school held a project night where students to present their various projects they had completed during the year. One project night, 2 7th grade boys went to the men's room. As they were washing their hands, 2 raccoons fell through the drop ceiling from the 3rd floor. The raccoons seemed surprised. The boys were scared and ran out of the restroom. The room was locked for the night with the 2 raccoons inside. The next morning, a trapper was called to take the raccoons away to Lancaster County to be released. The trapper arrived with a long pole and a cage, and one restroom door was unlocked. The raccoons began to make raccoon noises and angry raccoon noises. After about 5 minutes, the trapper calmly walked out of the restroom with the 2 raccoons in the cage. The trapper was hired to continue to come back at night to rid the 3rd floor of raccoons. After about a month, he had caged over 90 raccoons that were lodging on the 3rd floor. 7th graders were storing their middle-aged castle projects on the 3rd floor throughout the winter and spring. Many of the castles were made out of sugar cubes, and raccoons nibbled the sugar cubes throughout the winter. Perhaps the raccoons became diabetic.
That's funny.
It's a great story. Adam Holland is your classmate, right?
Yep, that's correct.
And he just mentioned, and I'd forgotten about this, the fire in the music wing right after it had been renovated in 1983 on junior school graduation day. Have there been any other, and I don't think there have, but Paul, did you run into any other serious physical crises like that one in your study?
Not really, some vandalism maybe sometimes, but it was usually done by outside people for that. And the fire was right before I came here. It was in June of 1981. And it happened right before lower school commencement, with fifth grade being rising sixth graders. But I don't know of anything because the fire was believed was started by a fourth grader who was leaving the school for that summer.
He was ultimately caught, right?
Well, they never proved it because he didn't confess to it. And they knew, the investigators knew who did it, but they couldn't prove it. So I think he got away with it.
Did he stay in the school?
I know no other
Oh, he
incident.
left.
Right,
He was
left.
leaving anyway.
Oh, I see.
This has been an extraordinary hour from somebody who loves that building as much as all the people who are watching and we do. Thank you, Eamon. I know
Well,
you're
that was
just
only
about,
half an hour. That wasn't an hour. It was only half an hour.
well, we can keep going if you guys are willing.
I can do this all night, yeah.
If there's other questions.
Are there any other?
I have a quick question about the Wissahickon and the Jordan building and the tunnel underneath that connects the two. What is the backstory behind that? Do you know how that came to fruition?
I don't know the origin of it, but I think it was, again, weather related.
Yeah.
Because as Clark stated about the arcade, one could go from the Jordan building through the tunnel, up the steps to the first floor of the inn, down by the math wing, outside, go down the steps to the arcade and across to the cafeteria. So my guess it had to do with again, the weather.
Yeah, I think it probably was the weather, and they didn't want kids even. It also controlled the kids as they were going from the art room primarily into the Jordan building, which in those days was kindergarten, first and second grades, and it kept people in line in a way that was both easy and safe and direct. Because I think that was part of the reason why that was built. And it was so easy to do. I mean, it was not a huge construction. It was not a huge addition to the cost of the Jordan building.
I think also the Jordan building was built about 1961, 62. And
Yeah.
the cafeteria at that time was in back of the library here. And so the kids could go to the cafeteria without getting wet and have their lunch and then go back again.
Is
And
the Jordan building,
the people I interviewed, I never came across a person that said the cafeteria was serving great food.
Well, it was
Yeah.
family style when I was there. Was it like that when either of you were?
No, it was a full-on cafeteria by the time I got there, and they had this brilliant system of punch cards that you would get. You'd pay $10, and you get a punch card, and the card would have little squares on it for each amount of money.
Yeah, but
And
you were eating over in the
The commons.
commons
Yeah.
area. But when the cafeteria was in, and I guess Paul, you didn't know the cafeteria. You didn't know the dining room when it was behind the library either, did you? Because that was.
No, I came in 81 and it
Yeah,
moved down.
that had moved in 69 or 70.
Yeah, that was a computer room when I was there.
I just remember warm chocolate chip cookies and chicken Maryland in the.
Chicken Maryland, the classic.
I remember there were
Yeah.
certain lunches that you just could not eat before track practice. You just
Like cheesesteaks.
yeah, you had to really pace yourself at lunch, especially when we're doing quarter miles.
Yeah, if Adam Holland is still there, I think Adam Holland ate a Snickers bar before a track or cross country race, and he regretted that.
Well, I think this has been terrific, and I'm awfully glad that you guys were doing it. And I had the thought as I was getting ready to say hello to you all that Boris Johnson and Joe Biden had a rather important get together in London or in England today. And I don't think that they had half as much fun as Eamon and Paul did. So thanks very much for doing this.
Final thing, I have to reveal the trivia answer.
Oh yes.
Oh,
yeah.
yes, the trivia answer,
The original school colors.
which I know. Go ahead.
Brown and gold.
Oh,
Brown and gold.
Yeah,
Oh.
and
That's terrible.
and what nobody knows is when or why it changed.
Oh, I know why it
Sometime
changed.
in the early teens, but nobody knows why. I think the reason is that brown and gold was just really ugly.
I think if you're a 13-year-old boy, you know the reason why they changed it.
Yeah, George School had those colors for a while. Now they're back to green and white. But brown and gold was not a good choice.
Yeah,
Anyway,
they went better. Do we know where blue and blue came from?
no,
The first Blue and Blue Day competition was in 1908, and it was a football game between dark blue and light blue.
and it was primarily founded, wasn't it, to keep the boarding school kids
Right.
with something to do when on off times like weekends and stuff.
Right.
And then it just grew into what it is today.
Do we know how they picked
The
the colors?
dark blues won this year, by the way.
I'm not sure why they picked dark blue and light blue,
Yeah.
but anything could have been better than brown and blue.
Just spin the wheel. Anything you land on is better. Well, Coach, thank you for doing this book, and thank you for your years of service to the school and to all of us who went through your teams over the years. Fantastic, important experience in my life, and it stays with me to this day. And I try to contribute some of those lessons to my own kids now. It's just so important to me over the years. And I thank you for everything you gave me and everything you've given the community.
A great note to end on. Thank you all very much.
Good to see you, Eamon.
Good to see you. See you soon.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.